No.
All right, take care.
All right. We got music on both phones. Everything working.
So this is Lunch and Learn. Eric, do you want to hear it? Okay.
For you. Are you the
Okay.
host? Are you the host? Dale?
Oh,
Hello, everyone. We're going to give people time to come in.
Recording. I and M and group. Exclusively in that order. I'll tell you what, that's gonna wear real thin, real fast. But hey,
And we're both gonna go on a Zoom call for an hour. Okay, so just send me the bill. Yeah. Okay. Anything you need to know? The same board?
And all the spring down was last year.
thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
People are still coming in.
I get it on the television.
No, it's okay this way.
Okay.
Put your name on here.
What do you have that's not crumbly or sticky?
Why don't you come over and watch it?
Far.
With a banana.
I can't hear you. Yes.
Oh, more people coming.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. While we're waiting, this is Len. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us on our first Lunch and Learn in 2022. And wanted to remind you to send me names of anyone that should be added to our list so that we can send notice to folks. Also, I wanted to mention that there's a good chance that one of our sessions later in the spring will be led by our own Cantor Hamash, which will be very exciting. I think maybe it's April, Eric. I can't remember if we decided, but her schedule is challenging. We'll see if it comes off, but I think that'll be something to look forward to. And
Yes,
finally,
she is in April. In fact, here I have the schedule. It is, well, you're stuck with me today. Then Rabbi Markowitz in February. I'm back in March. She's in April. And then we still have to figure out May and June. But
excellent. But most of all, before we start, want to hope that everybody is staying safe, and thank Rabbi Eric for another extremely topical presentation today. So if you know folks that want to be added to the list, email me. And Rabbi Eric, thank you again, and you have the floor.
thank you. Thank you. So today I am happy to first of all, to be back with you. Happy New Year, everyone. And I hope that everyone is staying safe and staying well and finding ways beyond even this to interact with people and see one another in ways that make you feel comfortable, though cautious, as we are all navigating. And that's going to be a major part of our topic today. I want to thank in advance Dr. Lenore Asbell, who is on today. And Lenore is going to be, and it's possible that we'll be joined by Dr. Ben Abella too, to sort of give a clinical piece. One of the challenges of this, one of the myriad challenges of this time is that, believe it or not, pandemic mitigation was not a class that I took in rabbinical school. And I know this is going to come as a shock to you all. And so I feel very blessed to have people that I lean on mercilessly to be the experts in this. And I invited them to come and give sort of the clinical side of this. I am really trying to give a Jewish lens on the emotional side of what it means to live in a world where risk and risk tolerance is sort of front and center, and everything we are doing is being viewed through a probability lens of infection rates and things like that. No matter what it is that we do, it sort of feels that way, and it means that our every action, our every interaction has that extra weight that 2 years ago it just simply did not have. And I think that there is a real psychological and also a real spiritual toll to that. There is and also a real understanding in Judaism of what risk tolerance means. And so, you know, when Len and I first discussed this a couple weeks ago, even then it felt like this topic had a different cadence and a different overtone than it does even right now. And if South Africa and other places where Omicron has peaked and is now rapidly, precipitously descending, if that is any indication of where we are, then, well, in 4 weeks from now, this topic may feel very different than it did today. And so in that sense, the conversation changes on an almost daily basis. What I'm going to do, I think, is I'm going to introduce this idea of risk tolerance and this sense of what it means to go out in a world where there are risks. It's just a fact of life. There always have been, perhaps not so front and center right in our face at all times. And then I want to introduce this through a Jewish lens, and then I want to turn it over to Lenore, and if Ben is able to join us. We were also supposed to have, as the third on our medical expert panel, though some of you are also, I believe, have medical training. The third was supposed to be Dr. Matt Kirshen, who sadly is being called in on a non-scheduled time because his hospital is being overrun right now, and so that gives us a sense of what is going on. We're going to talk about risk tolerance. We're going to talk about what that means. And we're going to talk about what it means through a Jewish lens, and then we are going to sort of use the pandemic as the example, as the clear and present, ripped from the headlines example of how people navigate this. And Lenore, as not only an expert in this, working in Department of Public Health in Philadelphia, but also perhaps an even more lofty title as immediate past president of Adath Israel. And even if she could possibly have soared to even higher heights than that, the chair of our Adath Israel Reopening Committee of medical experts. I mean, it doesn't get loftier than that. We're clearly coming into a place where this is of our mind. So let me go through some Jewish perspectives on this, and I'm going to share some. First of all, we are on 2 screens of thumbnails, so that means that I can't see all of you even when I don't share. So don't be shy about speaking up. Oh, Lenore also has some stuff going on at clinic too. So why don't we actually, before we go through the Jewish stuff, Lenore, do you want to say something about risk assessment and how you see people doing this? If you have to run, then please do run. But I'm going to turn it over to you first. We're going to flip the order just to give you a sense of that. You'll get first word, and then we'll be flexible here.
I feel a little bit off. I wasn't sure I was going to be speaking today. So about risk assessment, I think that this is something that we've all been doing now for the past 2 years. We all identify what our own risk is, given the data that we have, and knowing what our underlying issues are, and decide, given that, what risk we are going to take. But I think that part of that risk assessment, and part of what we've learned in these past 2 years, is that it's not only personal risk assessment, but there is some, in my role, I don't think necessarily about individual risk assessment, which we all think about, but about public health and public health risk assessment, and what each of our individual acts means to the greater population. So when we're looking right now, I mean, I think, taking where we are with Omicron, we have a risk. We know we've been vaccinated. Most of us, I'm assuming on this call, are vaccinated, boosted. We've decreased our personal risk of long-term complications and being hospitalized. We have not eliminated it, but our getting infected, which we may, even being vaccinated, also affects others. And as hospitalization rates increase, our risk tolerance for ourselves may be lower, but our risk tolerance for the population has to be considered as well. And that puts you at risk for other things, like people being turned away, short-term, procedures that you may need for other reasons. So all of those things need to be taken into consideration when we think about risk tolerance. And then balancing, life against that, but I'll let you talk about that because that's not my expertise.
Thank you, Lenore. And I know that you may have to go, so I'm sensitive to that. If you're here and there's other things that are said that want to be chimed in. What I think we should do is we'll go through some of the general premises of what it means to have risk tolerance. And there is that communal versus the individual, and every individual's case is of course, different and more difficult to navigate as well. And I think that all of that sort of falls, Judaism actually has language for all of that. So I'm going to share a screen now. Again, what that means is that I can see almost none of you. So if you have a question or you want to put something in the chat or you want to just unmute and shout out, go for it. I am going to screen share right now so that we can, here we go. So now you should be able to see my screen. So what I entitled this was Living Dangerously versus Living with Danger. And those are two very different things. And where we draw that line is very, very individualized. And as Lenore said, takes into consideration a number of communal and personal factors and considerations. The idea here is that Judaism in general does not want us to take undue risk, but Judaism recognizes that there is risk inherent in our lives. When we get out of bed, there is risk, and we see that, and that is demonstrated on a daily basis by the very fact of tragedy in the world. This is a theological statement that I'm making right here. We know that life is fragile because we encounter death. To quote, I think it was 6 Feet Under, that it was a show, a drama years ago. It says that that's what makes life critical, right? Is the fact that death exists. Some of those deaths we can accommodate into the sort of working of what life is. And some of those seem unimaginable, inexplicable, horrifically tragic, and without any sense of logic or how the world is quote unquote supposed to work. But every time a death happens, even one that we can sort of accommodate in, someone who lived to a very long life and accomplished much and felt like there was no bucket list left or anything like that, even in a situation like that, the fact of death reminds us that life is fragile and reminds us that our actions are impactful. That is just what death does. In fact, I was reading a book. Some of you may know the book Sapiens. I quote it all the time. There's a second one called Homo Deus that suggests that theoretically humans can almost overcome, in our technological advances, we can almost overcome the major causes of widespread death of the human species. That is to say, famine, pestilence, and war. And so the death rates could go so low that it may feel like we actually conquer death. And there are other realities to what that means that that are actually problematic. It may feel like we are doing something incredible and monumental, but it may have an incredibly negative effect as well. That goes back theologically to the idea that God essentially says to Adam and Eve, to the founders of humankind, there are basically two things that are going to keep you from being divine. The first of those you would attain by eating of the tree of knowledge, which, spoiler alert, they do, right? And the second is immortality, which you would attain presumably by eating from the tree of life. And the second that Adam and Eve eat from the tree of knowledge, God says to God's angelic court or whomever God is speaking to at that moment, God says, well, we got to kick them out of Eden. We got to seal off the tree of life because they already did the tree of knowledge. And if they do the tree of life in addition to the tree of knowledge, then essentially we got a ton of gods and no human beings. And so in modern times, Homo Deus, this second book by Yuval Noah Harari, says that we're getting dangerously close to that. And what that could do is that could make us, from an evolutionary standpoint, something more than we are right now. And not only that, it could make us what we actually imagine to be divine and godly. And once we do that, then life becomes less precious because life is infinite. It's a resource it's an infinite resource. And once a resource is without limit, it becomes without value. That's just a supply, and that's simple economics 101, supply and demand. If your supply is infinite, then your cost and your demand actually may go down. The price of something may go down. Someone may have two screens on right now. You have to mute. I can't do that for you in the moment. In fact, I may have to. Please mute yourselves if you're having. There we go.
How do we mute?
I muted you. Okay, there we go. So now I'm going to go back to the screen. There we go. So this is the idea that we are dealing with right now, is that living with danger actually makes life, while sometimes precarious, it makes life valuable. Living dangerously devalues life. You see that I'll say that again. Living with danger is what makes life valuable, because it is something that is worth taking a risk for, whatever calculated risk that is. Living dangerously, meaning living rashly, right? In that sort of way, actually devalues life. It's like if I put that crystal vase, if I purchase a crystal vase, I know in the purchase of that crystal vase and the amount of money that I've spent on that there is some percentage of risk that I'm taking that vase may break. If I play catch with that vase, with my 10-year-old, now 11, he just turned 11, that is living dangerously. That's actually devaluing the vase. You following? Everyone got that so far? Because now, unless someone wants to say something, I'm going to move on from that. I'm going to move on to some of the Jewish texts on this. All right. Here's the first one. Okay, this is a great song. It's a Rabbi Nachman quote, Kol haolam kulo gesher tzar meod, right? The whole world is a very narrow bridge, and the key is not to fear at all. Now, when Rabbi Nachman says this, he knows that we are going to be afraid. And so he sets this unattainable ideal out there that the world is a narrow bridge. I have asked people, I'm going to ask you all what you think that means. I'll give you some of the past examples. A narrow bridge feels precarious. Maybe it's the type of suspension bridge that shakes a little bit. Some people imagine in the past the one from is it Indiana Jones, where you have to take the first step before the bridge becomes even evident. I had a great one, I think it was last year, it must have been 2 years ago now. I asked some preschool kids, and one said, well, if it's a narrow bridge, you can't stand and hold the hand of your friend next to you, so you feel alone, right? And that sort of thing. So you have to imagine what it is to call the world a narrow bridge. It clearly is precarious. Would anyone like to, again, just unmute and say what that metaphor means to you for a second?
So actually, I might look at it differently, because if you say a narrow bridge, you're on a path, and you're on a clear-cut path. And if you're on that path, you don't have anything to fear. Whereas if you cross the bridge, you're fine, and you stay on the bridge. And whereas you have a wide open field, you can go anywhere. If you have a narrow bridge in front of you, it's very clear where you're going.
So David, thank you for that. So the idea of what David is saying is there's only one way to go, right? There's no left and right on a very narrow bridge. There's only forward. And that's interesting. I've never heard it that way, that the removal of choices for some people actually is reassuring. I think of, I may have told this group this story once. My third year or second year, I can't remember, early on at my time at Adath Israel, the congregation had grown to a certain point where we couldn't do reserved seating on the high holidays anymore. Some of you still remember and have nightmares about this, right? Okay. The reason being that people wanted to get into the sanctuary, and it was like going to a restaurant and being told by the maitre d' that all the seats were taken, and you look and you see there's 20 tables that are open there, right? So we couldn't, if everyone had a reserved seat, you couldn't, even if those people didn't show up, you couldn't give away their seat. And that was the problem. So we went to at least partially unreserved seating. Some of you may remember this. Some of you may still be angry about it. I apologize if you are. Anyway, moving on from that, the first day that we had unreserved seating, and we did all sorts of town hall, and I still remember Glenn Unterberger of blessed memory, who was a regular at this gathering. He led the process on this. He explained it to everyone. We sent it out. We talked about it. It was incredibly publicized. On the first day, someone walked in. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, the first time we weren't doing reserved seating, and she came in at 8:45 in the morning. Now, I don't know about you, and some of you probably, I'm not taking attendance, but I bet most of you don't even know this, but at 8:45 in the morning, in a 1,500 seat sanctuary, there's a lot of choice of where to sit if the seats are not reserved. And she came in and she stood at the back, and she was paralyzed. She had no idea where to sit. And so the usher said, and I only found out about this afterwards, the usher said, you can sit anywhere. All of the seats are open at this point in time. There was literally a minion there. And she was paralyzed. She could not do it. The usher had to take her by the hand and place her into a seat that the usher termed, this is your seat. Why? Because the world was a very wide bridge at that point in time. She could go absolutely anywhere. And so, David, to your point, the idea that we can only go, maybe that's the way that we avoid fear. That's a good impression of that. Any other thoughts on a narrow bridge?
Yes, I have one, Joshua.
Go ahead.
As a mild, with my mild fear of heights, that is not how I see the quote. A very narrow bridge means that you're much closer to the abyss as you cross it, unlike a wide road or even a wide bridge. And so I feel the peril when I'm on a very narrow bridge.
The margin of error then is much smaller.
Yes, and you can feel and see the alternative, which is plunging over into the water or whatever lies below. Yes.
Anyone else want to share? Okay.
I do.
Okay, go ahead.
You can hear me.
Yeah, is that
Margie
Margie?
Jacobs.
Yeah.
If there is a bridge, it usually means that people can come from the other side. It's two ways. So you can have people coming at you as you are crossing. So who gets to cross without encountering someone else on the other side?
So and specifically when you see that sign, narrow bridge, the implication is that you may have to give someone who's going the opposite direction the right of way, meaning that there's not enough space for us to come and go. This is like, the classic thing, the bridges, the underpasses, all that connect Montgomery and Lancaster are all, or also going from Wynwood into Narberth, right? They did not accommodate SUVs and minivans when they did that, right? You can't quite get two SUVs through that thing. You got to give people a little bit of breathing room, right? And that idea that who's going to get to go and who's not going to get to go. This is great. The second half of the sentence is the one that I want to focus on a little bit as well. This idea, and David, you mentioned it a little in your comment, that Rabbi Nachman is saying, don't be afraid. I think that this is actually hysterically funny in my own twisted mind, because think about what that command or that expectation or that key to life is. Don't be afraid. Have you ever said to someone, whatever you do, don't be afraid? What's the immediate thing that person does?
Be afraid.
Of course, their heart rate quickens. Whatever you say, don't laugh. Immediately someone laughs, right? Don't get mad, but no offense intended, but, right? All of those sorts of statements have the exact opposite effect. Why? Because you've keyed the brain to say, whatever you do, don't be afraid. And sort of course, everyone's heart rate starts to go up immediately at that moment, right? It's not at all, first of all, it's not rational. It's not controllable. And so when Rabbi Nachman is saying the key, now he's saying it's sort of like, it's okay, it's okay, it's okay. He's trying to maybe reassure here. But the idea is that when you tell people don't be afraid, and by the way, this is true of COVID, it's true of almost any sort of crisis moment in any moment whatsoever. When you say to people, it doesn't make sense to be afraid, or what you're doing emotionally doesn't make sense. Everyone, almost every person I've spoken to about how they are navigating COVID thinks that they are the rational one. And every person is doing it differently because people want to feel like I'm doing it. I have a thoughtful procedure. And if you look at it from a balcony, we know that almost no one has 100% consistency on these things. People are assessing the risk. They're saying, I'm going to go to my niece's wedding because that she's my closest niece and that's really important to me and I got to do this. I'm making up something here, right? Okay. And you look and you say, and someone from the outside who doesn't appreciate why that's a viable risk, because why is that a viable risk? Because I feel so close to that niece. But if someone doesn't have that closeness, they're going to say, oh my God, that person went to a 200-person thing, but they won't even come over to my house for dinner. But that's not the way these things work. It's not fully rational. It's not fully logical. So I'm going to give you a couple of other examples of what caution feels like and what fear feels like. This is a classic one. It's a commandment in the Bible, in the Torah. It's in the book of Deuteronomy, Parshat Ki Tetzei, that says, Ki tivne bayit chadash va'asita ma'akel leganecha. When you make a new house. By the way, it's the same thing. This is zoning laws, right? It's only on new construction. You can get grandfathered in on all these things, right? Okay. When you make a new house, you're supposed to put a parapet, a little wall around your roof. In ancient times, still, by the way, in a lot of places in the Middle East, roofs were flat. Roofs were flat for a number of reasons. First of all, it was a great place to dry things out in the heat, in the sun. It was also another living space. Especially with so little rainfall, this was a great way to just have living or storage space or gathering space. You were supposed to have a parapet, a low wall all the way around your roof. I have a picture of a parapet there for you. I hope you can see it. So that you do not bring blood guilt on your house if anyone should fall from your roof. You don't want people falling off your roof. I want you to look closely at that parapet. That is a parapet. But there are all sorts of laws in the Talmud of how high a parapet has to be. What is wrong with a parapet from a rational standpoint? Anyone want to say it? What's wrong?
I'm tall. I'm still falling off that roof.
You are falling. David, I'm not as tall as you. And I'm falling off that roof, right? Almost anyone grown is falling, maybe a child. Maybe like my Anna L, my 3-year-old, that might stop her, though I got to tell you something, she's pretty precocious. She could easily climb that parapet, right? Okay. A parapet does not rationally stop people from falling off a roof. It reminds people that the roof is near, that it does have that effect. It is a cautionary piece, but it does not seal off the possibility or even the probability that someone will fall. In fact, it's very easy to see someone losing their footing in the uneven sort of surface there and tripping and causing themselves to be endangered. But if that is the case, and if there is a parapet, according to Jewish law, you, the homeowner, are not liable. Now, if you don't have a parapet, you are liable, right? That's the idea of responsibility, and you can see that word down there. The word for responsibility is the same word for intermingled in Judaism. The idea that our fates or our responsibilities are intermingled is the way that we understand that idea of being responsible. And so it understands that a lack of caution, not setting up a parapet, is being complicit in these sorts of things. So you see how these, it's not all logic and rational. In fact, I think it was Lenore who sent me a quote yesterday of someone who was talking about how you can present all the data and all of the risk factors and all of the things about why masks work or why this works or why vaccine or why this, whatever. And at the end of the day, people are mostly making their decisions based on emotion. Because when logic and emotion go head to head, emotion almost always wins, even in the halacha here. I'm going to give you just a couple of other texts, and then we're going to talk. We're just going to talk for the remainder of the time. The other thing that is true and that Judaism recognizes is that danger is time-bound. It is contextual. And so I'm giving you a couple of key terms here. One of them is sakanta din nefasha, which is an Aramaic term that means sakanat nefesh, right? In Hebrew, which means danger to one's health. And I have a very perplexing picture on this slide. Can someone interpret this picture before I go forward? Anyone know this? What this picture is referring to in Judaism? It's a pretty obscure thing. Good.
Mixing fish with meat, right? You separate them
Yes.
for like, I don't know, even though fish is para, it's crazy.
So Lenore, you just said all of the points in that one sentence, right? Okay. There is a law on the books that goes back to the Shulchan Aruch. So it goes back, what do you want to call it? 700 years ago, 600 years ago. There's a law that says that though fish and eggs, but we're talking specifically about fish here, though fish is parav, you cannot serve fish and meat on the same plate. It is a law. And the reason for that law is that it is a sakanat nefesh. It was believed in that time, in ancient times, going back to the Talmud, but up through late Middle Ages, it was believed that eating meat and fish together was danger to your health. It would cause health problems. And therefore, if it were a danger to your health, and it is a Jewish law not to endanger one's own health, therefore it is forbidden, not having anything to do with keeping kosher, it is forbidden to put fish and meat on the same plate. And then Lenore, the other thing you said is, I don't know, it's crazy. So I will tell you this. I will tell you that in the conservative movement, not long ago, I want to say maybe 15 or 20 years ago, there was a tshuva, a legal responsum written that undid the prohibition about putting fish and meat on the same plate, meaning you can go to that buffet and you can load up your plate with no sense of breaking halacha, assuming all the things on the plate are kosher, but the fish and the chicken are fine on the same plate. And the reason is the rationale by which this was done was because Lenore just said Worcester sauce. Exactly, right? The reason that the conservative movement said that this was okay was because we could now prove clinically, medically, that there was no medical danger to putting meat and fish on the same plate and eating them at the same time. And so because it was no medical danger, and because it's not an abrogation of kashrut, of keeping kosher in any way, then the whole principle or the whole underlying premise for why you wouldn't do this, that it was a danger to your health, well, that's gone. So given that the premise for the mitzvah was gone, then you could remove the mitzvah. This, by the way, is a very slippery slope and a dangerous game to get into, that you remove a mitzvah because the premise of the mitzvah is gone, because like, think of how many mitzvot we could get rid of nowadays just because the premises feel, old. But this is what they said. And so in the end, in the conservative movement, at least, this is no longer an operative prohibition. However, I will tell you that up until amazingly recently, I don't remember when it stopped. If you were a waiter at Camp Ramah in the Poconos and you had the misfortune of getting in the randomized rotation of waiting on your bunk, on your cabin, you had the misfortune of being a waiter for Friday night Shabbat dinner, which no one wanted to do. It was always the worst meal to wait because everyone wants to be, doing Kiddush together and Shalom Aleichem and all the other stuff, and you want to be with camp, and instead you're in the kitchen waiting to carry out the meal to your bunkmates and stuff like that. So you're already upset. But in addition to that, the setup for setting the table ahead of time, if you were the waiter for Shabbos dinner, was that you had to add, in addition to putting all the plates and all the silverware and all the other stuff that you had to do, it was a rule that everyone had to put out on each place setting a paper plate and a plastic fork, in addition to the fine china that Camp Ramah uses on a typical basis, not at all. But you had to do that because before even the chicken and the chicken soup and all the other stuff came out for Shabbos dinner at Camp Ramah, you knew that everyone was going to have some gefilte fish. It was on the table. And so this was the gefilte fish plate. And I remember this as a camper. I remember this as a counselor. I remember this going well into the 2000s. I can tell you that always there was a separate plate for the gefilte fish before the chicken ever came out. And those plates were thrown out before you could eat the chicken. Totally irrational. Totally
I was just going to say that. That's totally hypocritical.
Totally irrational. It has nothing to do with kashrut, has nothing to do with anything except that the Jewish tradition, even into the early 2000s, the Jewish tradition had it in our kishkas, which, by the way, I also wouldn't put with fish, had it in our kishkas that you shouldn't eat these two things together. And that evolves. That's why I put that word ha'idana in there. Last Jewish text, and then we're going to have a conversation. Okay. Not only do things change based on scientific understanding and historical context and all the other things, considerations can change person to person in the same historical context. So I've given you one last text here, and this is another weird text. By the way, I don't know why this topic collected a whole bunch of weird texts. But this goes to the laws of mourning. And specifically, it's laws having to do with if once someone dies and you're in mourning, that you are prohibited certain grooming aspects of things. And there's all sorts of reasons as to why that is. Actually go back to our original conversation about how fragile life is and how when you're a mourner, you've come so close to contact with death that the things that remind us or affirm or are needed for life are suspended. And so during Shiva, perhaps many of you know, it's tradition not to do all sorts of grooming things, including shaving, in terms of also sexual relations and all of these sort of things that are the classic mourning things, one of which is about having to do with bathing. And so there's a story about Rabban Gamliel. I've talked to you about Rabban Gamliel before. He is not our nicest chief rabbi. He is very sort of upper crust, and the idea that he would not, take care of himself in the fine ways of finery, even in the context of mourning. Well, we learn a little bit about that. So this is a story about Rabban Gamliel. It says, Rachatz Laila Harishon Shemeta Ishto. He bathed on the first night after his wife died. This is, by the way, a significant thing because in ancient times, still true in the land of Israel, true in theory locally as well, burials happened almost immediately. right? The goal was, and that's why in Israel, many burials happen at night, because the idea is that by that evening, you're gonna get the person in the ground buried. So this is when it says on the first night after his wife died, the idea is he is now in mourning, he's done, and he's in Shiva. And not only is he in Shiva, he isn't even able to like wait until, he's not even able to wait until like, okay, the next day, or maybe he's taken a nap and he wakes up, or it's a hot sun or something like that. Nothing like that. He goes right to the bathhouse, right? Because remember also, you didn't bathe in your own house, though maybe Rabban Gamliel did. He was pretty wealthy. Okay, so his students say, Lo limadatanu, haven't you taught us, Rabbeinu, our rabbi, she'avel asur lirchotz, a person who is in mourning, it's forbidden for that person to bathe. And this is what Rabban Gamliel says, and it sounds a little, what's the word? Bougie, I believe is the word. It sounds a little bougie, but it actually is accepted as a halachic norm. He says back to them, Inik shar kol ha'adam. I'm not like the average Yosef out there. Istanis ani. I am an Istanis. And the way that the commentators understand what an Istanis is, it probably has a Greek cognate, is my skin is delicate. And so it would cause me, I would feel gross. And I couldn't do that. And it would give me undue tsuris, essentially. And so in my particular context, even though the law is that mourners should not bathe, I'm fragile. I'm I'm delicate. And so I can't do these things. And this is accepted as halacha. This idea of Rabban Gamliel being accepted as halacha, so much so that later on there are some commentaries that suggest that nowadays, in the way that we live our lives, we are all istanis. We are all, in some ways, not as hardy as the ancients, and so we wouldn't be able to manage in the same way. The reason I bring you this text, though, has nothing to do with whether you think that Rabban Gamliel is a wimp. We can have that conversation another time. The reason I bring you this text here is to show you that the halacha recognizes, the Jewish law recognizes that a person's individual complications or individual considerations can cause them even to undo the normative halacha. And so what that does is he actually withdraws from the halacha, and he does something that otherwise would be forbidden. And what that, you can see the parallel there in terms of how they're going to be, even long after Omicron is over, there are going to be different considerations that are going to cause individuals to buck the norm, to go against the norm. So I've given you a couple of texts here. I want to hear your thoughts. I want to hear your thoughts on how either you are navigating, and how, I'll say just this one last thing. One of the things I think that Jewish text asks us to do is certainly to assess risk, not to be cavalier. Remember, we have the texts that talk about a parapet and things like that. The Jewish text for sure says do not be cavalier. But Jewish text also recognizes that there are individual considerations. And Jewish text also says chai bahem, like we're going to have to, every one of us, assess what our individual risk tolerance is in this context. What are the risks, by the way, of being what are the risks that come with being more COVID cautious? And we should not underestimate those risks. I have seen those risks firsthand. Folks, the amount of counseling and and issues that I am helping with people do because of mental health considerations, because of economic considerations, because that the societal structures that automatically provided support in different moments are less robust and less assumed right now. Those things are real, and they are COVID complications. We may not put them in the categories of infection rates and things like that, but they are real. And they are affecting, there's an irony here, it's a bitter irony. They are affecting disproportionately the people who are most safe from the clinical COVID concerns, meaning teens and young adults are least likely to get COVID in ways that is dangerous, though it's not impossible, but they are much more likely to be affected by the mental health issues. And these are very real things that need to be navigated. We at Adith Israel know that there is no automatic calculation of this, right? We're doing this, there's no handbook for this. I will tell you that the people I listen to least are the ones who speak in absolutes, the ones who say either we should be doing whatever we wanted, every man for himself, it's totally fine, and everyone, and I don't have to wear a mask. If you choose to wear a mask, that's totally fine on you. That goes against, of course, what Lenore was saying about how there's this communal risk assessment. It's hard to listen to that person and take that as a good data point. Similarly, it is very difficult to listen to the people who are saying, every time we do something that is gathering, that is an act that is mass endangerment. You are potentially murdering our community. When I hear that, and by the way, I know it sounds like I'm speaking in extremes, but I have heard those words. And when I hear those words, I also say that's not a person who's actually assessing risk. That's a person who's assessing absolutes. And those are difficult things to hear. They become very difficult data points that you can't accommodate those data points. I will never be cautious enough for the second person. I will never be open enough for the first person. Because I'm navigating, not I, we have a panel of experts, we're navigating a whole bunch of risk tolerance. We're navigating it for our community. We're navigating it based on public health data. We're navigating it based on probabilities of what is or is not, what is more or less likely to cause a transmission and infection. We have kept our transmission rate incredibly low, incredibly low because of our caution. It does not mean that we will not have people who get COVID under our auspices, but we're doing the absolute best we can. And the way we're doing it is we're saying that there is going to have to be a tolerance of risk. This is the last thing I promise, last thing I'm going to say. The only way out of this is that gradually we are going to have to assess and reassess our risk tolerance. Gradually, whether that means we say a lot of people are going to get this, but very few people are going to get very, very sick. That is an assessment of risk tolerance. Or maybe we say, not now, but soon. That is an assessment of risk tolerance. The only way that we emerge from this isolation and the risks that it brings is if we reassess what our tolerance for risk is. In the same way that we do that when we get in a car or on a plane, or when we send our kids to school every single day. There are risks that we are accepting on ourselves. We need to do everything we can to mitigate those risks. Vaccines are a classic example of that. Getting our youngest kids vaccinated, certainly. Antivirals, all of the other things that I'm not an expert in, but we know exist out there. We need to mitigate the risks as much as we can. But at some point in time, we will never get to a point where the risk is zero. We will never even get to a point where our risk is almost zero. This is going to be part of our risk tolerance assessment going forward. It's not going away. And at some point in time, we are going to look at ourselves in the mirror, individual cases, and we're going to say, it's more important for me to engage in this for other reasons, and I'm willing to shoulder the risk that comes with that because I have to go to that Shiva, because I have to be a part of this community, because I have to be with that person who needs me. I acknowledge that my risk assessment on this as a rabbi is very different than most of yours, right? I've been with you since March of 2020, doing outdoor funerals, right? We know that. Doesn't make me better or worse. I'm not saying there's any virtue in that. Believe me, in most cases, I felt there was very little virtue in it. But that understanding of accommodating risk within our calculus is true. It's, by the way, why I think that Israelis are very good at this. Israelis assess risk tolerance every day of their lives in a different way. They're trained to do this in a military way. Their society trains them. In the times when Israeli society wasn't succeeding in this, it was probably because they were doubting their leaders' assessment of the risk and the tolerance of the risk. But Israelis are programmed for this. They're wired for this in a different way than we are. We actually, some of us thought that we could beat this and get the risk down to zero or really damn close. It's just not the case. And so our next challenge is going to be, how do we lower the risk to a tolerable level? And then what is that tolerable level by which we as individuals with our individual circumstances venture forth? We've all already done it. If you've eaten inside of a restaurant, if you've eaten outside of a restaurant, if you've had a dinner with one person, if you've had a dinner with two people, if you've had a dinner but only had everyone rapid tested first, if the rapid test wasn't good enough, if you had everyone PCR tested and then they stayed in for those 3 days while you're waiting for the PCR, maybe they didn't stay in for the 3 days while they're waiting for it. Every single one of you has done this already. Some of you have come to different conclusions than others, but make no mistake, we are all in this process right now. If you go on vacation, if you don't go on vacation, if you send your kids to school, if you don't send your kids to school, every single one of us. Have you seen your grandkids? Have you not seen your grandkids? And every one of us knows that there is a price for not seeing your grandkids. That's a price too. So I'm going to stop talking for the last 10 minutes here, and I'll stay on a little later. But that is that's what Judaism says. Judaism asks us to assess our risk, asks us to take risks seriously, but also to assess our risk tolerance so that we do not miss out on other things that are very much part and parcel of what it means to live as well. Yes, Lenore says part of the problem is that to determine your own risk tolerance is that with changing data, it's hard to assess the risk, right? I mean, the data is constantly changing, and the criteria on which we assess it. You know, the CDC going from 10 days to 5 days was in part because there was a calculated greater risk of not having doctors and nurses and other hospital staff in the hospitals than the amount of time when you were most infectious, and having people out for 10 days meant that no other people weren't going to get care. It has nothing to do with whether the virus exists or not. It doesn't even certainly has to do with infection rates. It has to do with whether if you do get infected, who's going to be there on the other end to hold you in the hospital. That itself is a changing data point. Anyone else? You can put it in the chat, or you can unmute and share your thoughts.
Joshua here.
Okay.
Even with changing data points, it seems pretty clear that a point does come at which, to pick an obvious example, it's more dangerous to drive your kid to school than to have your kid in school. In other words, there's a greater likelihood of a bad traffic accident than of a child getting seriously ill in school. And at that point, where the driving is more dangerous, then since you've been doing that since the kid was started school, obviously you accept that risk and you should bring the kid to school. And I'm very concerned about 2 years of remote learning for people with the attention span of a mosquito.
Right, though remember, Josh, also you well said, but remember also there's a ripple effect of risk tolerance as well, because that kid may or may not have an immunocompromised parent, sibling, or grandparent. And so the idea of personal risk, and I think this is also for looks like Stuart put something in the chat. You're right that as an individual, we're going to decide those personal risks, but there is a ripple effect for all of those risks. So I can imagine a person saying, I remember I have a relative who this is years ago, was going through a bone marrow transplant. And the doctor said, this is well before COVID, the doctor said, you know what, October to early April, you're not really going out so much, right? Because it was flu season. Now, is that the difference there, of course, is that was an individual as opposed to this being a societal decision that's being made. But that is, to my mind, that is a legitimate decision to make for that individual because of the ripple effect of these things, right? And I could imagine, depending on someone's risk tolerance, I could imagine that person saying, okay, but my grandkid who goes to school can't come and see me, but that has effects too, right? Let's see how this all works. Anyone else?
Yeah, I think that, Susan, that time, as you mentioned, has a lot to do with it. We thought we had a definitive end and we don't. So I could not see my grandkids for 2 months, but I couldn't not see them for a year. So that's the way I think time is another variable that affects the decisions.
Especially when it comes to family relationships and mental health, the longer the time does have a deleterious effect. And by the way, we're not even talking about the things. My father is an attorney, and my father does mostly real estate law. And he had a client who, as soon as the courts reopened, I guess, the first back in summer of 2020, was very anxious to get the whatever deal that had been put on hold because the courts were closed to get it moving. I don't know any of the details. I'm giving you very broad brush here, right? And this, you heard this all the time. And the court said when you called the clerk to get on the docket, I hope I'm using the right words here. When you called the court to get on the docket, the court said, "I'm sorry, you're at the bottom of the list." And of course, the client doesn't want to hear that. And the answer was why? Because all of the courts right now are dealing with domestic violence and domestic abuse cases. Every single court is dealing with domestic violence and abuse cases. Why? Because for the last, at that point in time, 3.5 months, those people had been trapped in the same home. And so your land deal probably doesn't take precedence over that, right? And so time is a huge issue here. As the time goes out, the mental health stuff, the domestic vulnerabilities, the economic vulnerabilities. We've given out tens of thousands of dollars, thanks to the generosity of a few of our members. We've given out tens of thousands of dollars in direct aid to individuals who just don't have the money to pay the electric bill or the heating bill right now. And that's in Lower Merion, by the way. Don't think that we're immune. And Michelle says the mental health impact on those providing the healthcare is being absolutely. People are just leaving the hospital scene. Like they're done. That doesn't bode well for the fact that we need our hospitals more than ever. So this is tricky. At some point in time, there will be, as some of you have sort of intimated, each of us will get to the sort of rip off the Band-Aid moment, right? Where we say, enough, I can't handle it anymore. And we will accept on ourselves a certain level of risk that a month before that would have felt unimaginable. Certainly 2 years before that would have felt unimaginable. I've seen this with countless people, that they're doing things now that they were so cautious before, but at some point in time, we all hit our limits, and we say, assuming best intentions, assuming best intentions, right? We hit our limits and we say there are other deleterious effects for not taking that risk. I'm risking elsewhere by not taking the risk on this. And those calculations become tricky, and they certainly are not uniform. There's not going to be one moment. I think there was an early time, I'm talking like the first April or May, where I was imagining some like let my people go moment, right? Where like, we just opened the doors of the shul and everyone just came pouring in, and we had some, massive open, throw caution to the wind, everyone doing a hora and massive face licking moment, and that ain't happening because we're too scarred from this, right? But I think we have to know, and we have to be compassionate to one another, that we're going to be there at different times. I'm going to be talking about that a little bit more on about what that moment might feel like. That idea that we have to be kind and give most people the benefit of the doubt on that, which our society is not wired right now to give each other the benefit of the doubt with differences of approach and theory and philosophy. If you haven't noticed, we're not good at that right now. The difference of opinion comes with benefit of the doubt. If you haven't noticed, we're not so practiced on that, having nothing to do with COVID, or maybe a little to do with COVID. So anyway, I want to thank you all. I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes if people want to share, but these are some really good comments that have come in. And we just treat each other with love as different people navigate this. So I hope that that's what we can do, because we're not going to navigate it at the same time. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure thing.
Very. It helps us navigate the situation.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you.
Right?
Take care.
We're
Good to
all
see
in
you,
this
Elaine.
together.
Yeah, good to see you.
I'm gonna leave.
Take care, all. Take care. All right, I will finish out here. Have a good day. Stay safe.